Well, welcome everyone to the second panel. My name is Emily Badger. I'm a reporter at the New York Times, and I'm joined by a really wonderful panel of people who are going to bring a lot of different perspectives, specifically on thinking about how we can increase housing supply in the coming years. I'm joined at the end by Andrew Jakabovics, who's the Vice President for Policy Development at Enterprise Community Partners. Celia Smoot is the Senior Vice President at KeyBank. Matt Reilein is the President and CEO of the National Equity Fund, and Priya Jayachandran is the CEO of the National Housing Trust. And I'm going to follow Sarah's lead from earlier this morning and not tell you any more about them because you all have their bios in your programs, and we want to spend our time talking about housing supply. But I'm really excited for us to have this conversation because I feel like this is such a sort of interesting and important moment for people who work on this topic, or like me, I'm sort of adjacent to people who work on this topic, in that this feels like a moment that's extremely both validating and alarming when we're thinking about housing supply. It's validating in the sense that if you have been working on this topic and you have been warning people about the problem that has been building with the shortage of housing supply for a long time, now everybody is listening to you, right? Or if you write about it now, people are starting to read about it and they're more interested in it. And the fact that we just had a presidential election that was substantially about housing, and not just about housing affordability, but specifically how can we build more of it. I mean, this is not something that I have ever seen in my lifetime or in my time reporting on this topic. And so it's a really sort of wonderful moment and opportunity, but it's an opportunity because the problem has become so alarming, right? So so both the thing that's validating about it and the thing that's alarming about it are sort of one and the same. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to ask Andrew to give us just a little bit of walking through some data to ground us all in sort of a common understanding of both what the scale of the problem is and how we got here. And so Andrew is, we're going to welcome him up here. He brought some slides. I don't know if you brought any movie stills.
No, sorry, nothing.
Okay.
No family movies or any, like no E.T. or anything like that.
All right, well, I'm turning it over to Andrew, and then we will take it from there.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Emily. Thank you, NAAHL, for offering me this opportunity, and really appreciate the fact that all of you are willing to stick around and look at some data after lunch. It might put you to sleep, in which case the panel itself will hopefully be sufficiently riveting, or your neighbor will kick you in the shins. So there we go. So before we get into the supply side of the housing story, just a little bit of level setting in terms of demand, right? Because housing is both a supply question and a demand problem. So current US population is about 337 million people, making up a little more than 131 million households, of whom a little over 34% are renters. That's about 45.5 million households. And those renters have a median income of under $52,000 in 2023, compared to slightly more than $95,000 for homeowners, right? So there's already kind of a purchasing power gap between the median renter and the median homeowner. Cost burdens disproportionately fall on renters, and particularly those whose incomes are below 60% of the area median income, with increasing severity the lower down you get on the income spectrum. So this chart here shows looking back to 1990 with the two decennial censuses, and then ACS data moving forward, and then some projections that we did building off of Joint Center Housing Studies at Harvard, forward-looking projections for population and cost burdens. So this looks at the absolute number of households experiencing moderate, defined as more than 30% of income, or severe, defined as more than 50% of income being spent on shelter, on rent. Those cost burdens are over time. And then again, looking forward into the future. So you can see that even if we keep kind of some of the estimates in terms of percentages constant over time based on population change, we do see increasing burdens moving forward. Also note, importantly, that this data doesn't account for individuals experiencing homelessness. So add, in terms of cost burden, another 12.2 million severely cost-burdened households shown in 2023. We can also add roughly about 653,100 people who experienced homelessness on a single night in January of last year. And one of the things that we do know, now tying back into supply, is that inadequate supply of housing makes homelessness, the challenges of homelessness, worse. Okay, off to supply. So here's a snapshot of the current housing stock. The orange bars at the bottom are housing units that are owner-occupied. The dark blue are rental, and the green ones are vacant, available potentially either for ownership or rent. So this is a distribution of about 145 million housing units in the United States. 89% of the owner-occupied stock is in single family. It also, about 84% of the 1980s and 1990s vintage is single family. That's less than the overall 89% of the stock. That is accounted for by a much larger share of manufactured housing that was, of the current stock that was built or produced in those years. So just keep in mind the need for manufacturers as a potential source of affordable housing, thinking about kind of sources as we think about supply moving forward. But the supply looks a little bit different in terms of the vintages and distributions for the rental stock that is occupied. So narrowing the focus a little bit to the rental housing supply, it's worth noting the elevated share of homes that are provided in small and medium-sized multifamily properties. So that's anything from 2 up to 49 units in a building. We know from other research, not just the distributions here, that is a critical source of affordable housing, often without subsidy, and it also serves a larger share than its share of the overall stock in terms of providing housing for voucher holders. So smaller properties, typically more affordable, and provide an outsized share of homes for voucher users. It's also, by the way, as an aside, less likely to be owned by a corporate entity than large multifamily is. So again, a significant share of the small multifamily stock was built in the 1970s and 1980s. And when we talk about missing middle and some of the typologies, it's important to recognize that less than a quarter of that small and medium-sized multifamily stock has been built in the last 25 years, compared against about 40% of the existing multifamily homes that are in larger multifamily properties built since the year 2000. So the question is, okay, so we've got about 145 million housing units. This is the distribution of rental. Like, are we providing enough? Well, how do we add to the supply of homes over time? So the spoiler is we probably are not producing enough, and if you probably didn't need me to stand up here and tell you that. But this also, by the way, does not capture any housing loss. So this is just completions on an annual basis going back about 50 years. So in that 50-year span from 1974 to 2023, we averaged about 1 million single-family completions annually. But you can see that green line, it's hardly been steady. Matt, I can share slides as well afterwards. Single-family production peaked in about 2006. Hasn't come back, although 2022 was the first year of single-family completions that rose above 1 million since the Great Recession. That 14-year stretch was longer and deeper than any previous period of sub-million unit annual completions going back to over that time series. So we're also building far fewer multifamily units than we used to as well, compared to the 1970s or 1980s. Again, that's that blue bar. You can see where we've kind of leveled off over the last 20 or 30 years compared to the 1970s and 1980s production numbers. And then that very, 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 very low line at the bottom. On orange are the small multifamily, so that's 2 to 4 unit properties. Again, as an aside, those are financed through the single-family channel. So as we think about rental affordability and rental support on the finance side, it takes both the single-family channels and the multifamily channels to provide a complete picture of how we support acquisition and development of those properties. But we've basically post-lunch. We've been producing fewer than 10,000 2 to 4 unit properties annually since 2010. So are we keeping up? So flipping the numbers as we typically look, rather than higher lines being better, here lower numbers are better. These are existing households per new unit completed. So the way to think about this is how many potential households are out there that are going to potentially compete for this newly created housing unit. And so when we say that we're not keeping up, well, single family is slowly drifting back towards that 100 households per housing unit, which is still, again, below that 1970s and 1980s number. 2 to 4 unit production, relatively small in the data set. It was about 1 new unit per 2,000 households in the 1980s. About 2,000 to 4,000 households until the Great Recession, and now it's about 1 new housing unit for every 13,000 households in the United States. So if you happen to really have your heart set on occupying a 2 to 4 unit home, there may be 12,999 people or households ahead of you. So, multifamily. So now looking at 5+ construction primarily, or exclusively. So keep in mind that back in 1968, there were 200 million people living in this country, and we were producing a new housing unit in a multifamily building for roughly every 500 people. So 500 people, and this is now people, not households, in part because multifamily household sizes look different than single-family household sizes, so it's useful just to look at people that might be choosing to occupy. Also, new household formation. If you're emerging from an existing household, multifamily housing may be your first venue of either choice or access. And so this looks at people, so it's not, you can't line it up against the previous slide, but generally the trends hold the same way. So in 2022, we were producing a new unit for every 928 people. And basically, just in terms of long-term historical trends, it's been one new unit for every 900 or worse since 1991. Last year, it finally fell below that number to 1 in 775 people in the country. But for comparison, in the 1980s, the decade-long average was one new housing unit for every 584 people. So slowing multifamily activity over a very long period of time. And by the way, in this past year, or this current year, because it's still December, in the first half of the year, which is the most recent data that we've got, first half starts were about 162,500 compared to about 260,000 last year over the same first half of the year. So we're starting to see a slowdown in that activity. So if you look at the dashed lines going out to the right, kind of going forward, looking at population growth, so CBO population growth is expected to be about 23 million over the next 15 years. It's about 7% of the population. Without getting into what the breakout of the generational changes are across population sizes and different generations, you can see that the blue line at the bottom is kind of completions needed if we want to just keep pace with the last 5 years, right? So it's definitely higher than it was in the late 90s, early 2000s until the Great Recession. Also keep in mind that we sort of still have to build out our way back from about 5 years of non-production at all. But looking at that, right, you can see that we are otherwise producing at a rate of about one housing unit for every 300, about 400 households, right, compared to the levels that we produced back in the 1970s, which was, the reverse. If we were going to keep up with our 1970s numbers, right, we would be producing far more housing units than we do, sort of roughly 2 to 1 at the current levels. So that's where the gaps are. And with that, I will turn it back to Emily to take us through a conversation around, I guess you don't need this, around what we might be able to do to increase the supply. So, thank you.
So the answer is no, we're not building enough houses.
No.
Okay. So our goal then is to build on the conversation we had this morning and start talking about some very specific policy levers and ideas that we think could be pulled in a lot of at both multiple levels of government, within the private sector as well as in the government, to try to start to change this. And so the first question I want to ask, just sort of going down the line of everyone, is if you have the opportunity to tell the new administration, this is one thing I want you to do first. I want you to focus on. I have the power to make you do it, specifically to solve the supply problem, including both building new supply, but also thinking about supply as inclusive of preserving the supply that we already have. What would that one thing be? Priya, do you want to start?
Sure. I think for me, the one thing would be rental assistance. I think rental assistance in this country has gotten a bad rap. Section 8 isn't a particularly attractive brand, but rental assistance works. I would argue it is good for tenants, it's good for owners, it's good for government, and it's good for communities. I think that the criticism often against affordable housing owners, particularly those of us who use the LIHTC, is that we don't operate like regular real estate. We don't have cash flow. We don't invest in our properties all along. We wait for this government subsidy in the form of LIHTC, and then we do it all. Rental assistance would allow us to do that. What I think a lot of people who don't understand affordable housing don't understand is that by definition, by statute often, we can't maximize our cash flow. Other multifamily real estate owners, when their expenses go up, they raise their rents to cover the increases. By definition, we can't and don't want to do that. But it means that we don't, therefore, have the margin and the cushion to reinvest in our properties. And the result is what we're seeing across the country: affordable housing aging and deteriorating badly, and no resources to reinvest in that. Then you think about rental assistance, where you have a rental assistance contract that typically covers 30%, where a resident pays 30% of their income for the rent, and the government makes up the difference. What that does is sizes the rent obligation to a tenant's ability to pay, gives the owner a reliable and underwritable source of income to be able to plan to reinvest and support their community long term. What it gives the government and the community is a stable asset that they know is going to be stable for the long run, and for the government, protects their original investment in having subsidized it up front, and therefore minimizing the resources it's going to put in it later to either replace it or prop it up when it becomes so dilapidated.
Yeah. Matt, you want to?
Sure. I feel like we're just going to build on each other's. So I would have, in addition to rental assistance, I would say we can tie it up in a nice, neat bow. Pass the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, and fundamentally, there's many components of that, but the two biggest components are increasing the supply of the 9% tax credits, which are competitively allocated at the state level, and it lowers something called the 50% test for the 4% credits. And there's a lot of percents in there, but what you need to understand is what that would allow is, in most states, allow the use of bonds to finance more affordable housing on a go-forward basis. And so if you want to think about it in real sort of broad terms, the 9% credit is going to address the dearth of new construction. It will allow more resources to flow into the new construction of multifamily housing that Andrew was talking about that we're not building enough of now. There continues to be strong demand, certainly by developers, certainly by renters, for that type of housing across the country. There remains very strong demand from investors in those tax credits, and so the market would continue to clear even at the this pretty material levels that the Credit Improvement Act is supporting. On the other side, with the 4% credits, the units that would be created through bonds, it's a little bit more of a preservation tool. So to Emily's question around preservation, these are for buildings that may have been LIHTC properties 15, 20 years ago, but now need to be materially rehabbed so that they're up to not just code, but up to a place where people actually want to live. And so that's where the 4%, in my view, if we had to prioritize those two provisions, the 4% or the 9%, I would actually say let's fix the 4%, because you're going to benefit the preservation of these units, and we all know that it's a lot less expensive to preserve a current unit than it is to build a new unit, and so you would see even more dollars or even more bang for your buck as a taxpayer out of the 4%. So I could deliver the package to the administration on day one that they could move through Congress and sign into law.
Very helpful.
So if I had that power to address the new administration, I definitely would have them focused on the fact that, as building on everything that Priya and Matt would say, is that all of these things require the sense that there's this cohesiveness and working between the federal and the state and local levels. During my career, most of the most innovative housing solutions that I have come across have been when real great magic has happened between the federal programs and the kind of energy and commitment from the local and state government. There are a lot of programs and a lot of funding sources that the federal government does provide to help energize and catalyze at the local and state level. Home Dollar, CDBG, all those programs are instrumental to helping to keep to create new units and to preserve older units. You know, we talk about the 4% credit and expanding that and the ability of kind of lowering that 50% test to 30% test. That's great. But in a lot of those transactions that we all know, there has to be some other types of kind of local subsidy that comes to bear in those programs in order to make those deals work. And a lot of that comes from the local and state governments.
I guess one of the nice things about going last is that I just get to say ditto to everybody else, and it frees me up to come up with something else.
No, you only get one thing, just one
So
thing.
one other thing. So the other thing I would add, and it's more on the regulatory side, has to do with the future of the GSEs, I would say, and then making sure, right, that there's ongoing stability in the mortgage markets, both for multifamily and for single family. And so it's kind of take a do no harm approach and really understand like the complex mechanisms and ways in which capital flows and ensuring that it continues to flow, particularly into underserved communities, through things like duty to serve, equitable housing finance plans and the like, those are both statutory and regulatory obligations, and that attention should continue to be paid to ensure that that capital flows to places that have typically been starved of it.
Yeah. Well, I also wanted us to talk about a handful of ideas that the incoming administration has broached in a number of different contexts and sort of pick apart how helpful we think they would be. You know, one thing that I'm sure we will spend a lot of time talking about over the coming 4 years is removing barriers to development. And, you know, this is potentially an area of some bipartisan agreement, but in some ways it's probably not going to be. And so, you know, sort of similarly, you don't each have to give me one, but do any of you have a really clear, obvious example of, you know, if this one barrier, if we were to do something about it now, it would make my life and my work easier? Yeah.
Prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon. You know, I think it's a lightning rod for Democrats, but for affordable housing developers who rely on federal money, we are often required to pay prevailing wage, and it can increase your hard construction costs by up to 30%. And that the subsidy doesn't go up commensurately with that. And I think that we have to think long and hard about, you know, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And, you know, to the comment earlier about the everything bagel, I think figuring out what is our highest priority and what is the most efficient way to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would build on the cost of building affordable units, right? And in some respects, it doesn't particularly matter whether you're building an affordable unit or a market rate unit in the grand scheme of things. The cost is largely the same, or in many respects the same. And so when you see the cost of lumber and steel going up 30, 40% in some markets, when you see finished goods, everything from elevators to dishwashers, to refrigerators, all going up, and we, as Priya alluded to earlier, that by the nature of affordable housing, we do not increase rents to cover those costs, right? It's based on what people can actually afford. And so that starts to squeeze the ability to build those units. And so you need to have more subsidy going into each unit, which nets fewer units over time. So, you know, I think one of the things that we're focused on is the potential ricochet impact of a tariff regime that could drive those costs up even further, and not having an offsetting amount of subsidy or assistance for affordable housing.
Yeah, so there's, Sarah touched on this earlier, you know, part of what makes this work so hard is that there's tension between sort of goals that we may find to be sort of equally valid. And for the Trump administration, there's going to be a tension between, you know, their policies around tariffs and their policies around wanting to have affordable housing. But there also is the tension, which was briefly raised earlier today, between, you know, sort of coming more from policy on the left, between wanting to, you know, build a new housing that incorporates sustainability and our climate goals. And in some ways, that too is in tension with the goals of making housing more affordable, making it cheaper to build more of it. And so I wonder, specifically thinking about that piece of resiliency and sustainability and climate, how you all think about how you would deal with that in light of the fact that, everyone's guiding North Star right now is affordability.
So I'm just going to try to twist that and make it a much more broader thing, and that is that one of the things I constantly think about when we look at affordable housing deal and whether or not we're kind of building in what I call, there's a tendency to use housing as the catalyst to address every social ill, and there's a cost to that.
We do that at private developers, but we also do it of affordable.
Yeah, right. And you tend to obviously see that much more in the affordable space. So when we think about like that kind of incremental cost that's associated with that, I always think about it. What is driving that incremental cost? It's compliance. Everyone to address resiliency, there's a compliance aspect to that, where there has to be someone who has to address and put together the documentation or the information to show that you are addressing whatever particular sustainability issue. Same thing with some of the affordability and that cost and in reality, but what happens when an affordable housing developer, when other financial players and intermediaries are also having to be in that kind of ecosystem and mechanism and trying to figure out a way to make sure we're building the housing, but we also, there's a sense we want to make sure we're building the housing and keeping it affordable, but is there a way to kind of streamline some of those compliance requirements so that, and I'm a recovering lawyer, so that we don't keep making lawyers and accountants very, very rich, and yeah.
So I think the compliance is sort of like deferring to, as long as there's a trusted pair of eyes on something, right, at various phases and under a variety of programs, right, there are ways to potentially streamline some of that. But going back to your comment about the sort of tension between sort of resilience and cost, right, I think that if we take the lens of a risk reduction lens, right? So if public investment is going into these properties and we're thinking about the life cycle of the property, so it's a little bit different than life cycle cost, but really sort of like, how do I maximize the number of person years or whatever metric you want to kind of, however you want to calibrate it, coming out of a property that we are putting public dollars into? Having that property resilient so it will withstand the storm, so that the most socially vulnerable individuals are then not subject to homelessness in the wake of disaster, lost habitability, lack of access to their jobs because they have to now travel, right? Like all of those costs we don't layer on to the fact that we are investing in a property that's built to withstand or in retrofit to withstand some of these climate events. Right, so if we think about it from that perspective, right, that these investments are very much in alignment, so we are investing today for the long term, right? So it's beyond the 15 or the 30 or the 50 years, right? But these are properties that we can reliably know, right, are going to be there for the populations that they serve. And I think one of the challenges that we face just in terms of the conversation around like operating costs, right, is the rising cost of insurance. And perversely in some cases, when owners are making necessary investments or valuable investments in properties that make them less subject to risk, what we see is from the perspective of the insurance underwriters, oh, you invested more in the property, there's never more value in place, and therefore I'm going to raise your premium because my replacement costs are going up. As opposed to, oh, right, you've now reduced the risk of loss, and therefore I should recognize that in the cost of the insurance, right? So those are those tensions that we see, but they're not necessarily, I think, inherent in the affordability versus resilience question. I think it's part of how we're defining where the costs are and where the benefits lie.
Could we linger on insurance for a little bit
longer?
Happy to. when we had a conversation about some of these ideas previously, Matt, you described the problem of rising insurance costs as simultaneously boring and almost insurmountable.
Yeah.
And so
It sums up my life, though.
Can you try to surmount it for us somewhat? I mean, how? Obviously, you have to find it's not sufficient to say there's just nothing we could do about it. But this is a real this is another part of the sort of mounting costs that are coming from lots of different sources. And
yeah. So I would I'll take a big picture and then zero in on the insurance for a second. Right. We talk a lot about upfront costs and the capital of building a new building, and there are resources for that, and there's people that want to show up at the groundbreakings, whether it's the public officials or the investors, local individuals. But then we sort of forget about the ongoing operating costs of these buildings. And so insurance is a particularly sticky issue because it is entirely out of the control of any individual owner, regardless of size, whether they own one building or whether they own 10,000 buildings. It is controlled by a market that is well beyond even the domestic economy. And so when you're talking about an affordable building where we do not have the ability to raise rents to cover costs, and you have an insurance premium that increases 50 or 100% year over year, that starts to squeeze everything else out. So that's why it's a bit insurmountable. If you have high cost of property management, you can look for a new property manager. The issue is with the insurance market, at the end of the day, you might get 1 year of reprieve if you switch carriers, but it's going to catch up because everyone is still working with the same reinsurance companies, and it's only a matter of time before it cycles back. So that's why it's insurmountable. So your question is, it can't be insurmountable. I do think that, and this is something that's not currently on the docket in a formal way, but I do think there's got to be some government intervention, and people have talked about it as similar to FDIC type of insurance for affordable housing that gives you the backstop, that gives these private organizations that are ultimately providing the insurance some level of safety, that if there's a catastrophic event, there's going to be government support, there's going to be a government safety net for the market to clear. Otherwise, it is difficult to see how there's a market solution driven by market solution that comes to affect the insurance companies. The last thing I'll say is that insurance companies are also state regulated, so that there's a level of complexity there where how do you have the federal government apply this in a uniform manner across all 50 states and jurisdictions. I do think there's a way to do that when you tie it into certain types of subsidies, LIHTC being a great example, Section 8 being another great example where you could see the federal government stepping in to provide that type of backstop.
Another idea that I think we're going to probably hear a fair amount about over the coming years, and which also was touched on very briefly this morning, is manufactured housing. And this is another idea where there's sort of a big gap between the promise that it offers and all of the little problems that have to be solved in order to make it more viable at scale. Mm-hmm. Celia, could you walk us through a little bit like what some of those obstacles are to figuring out how to finance them?
And so when we were prepping for the panel, I had mentioned that I work at a bank, and one of the things that we actually have financed a couple of manufacturing projects, and there was a lot of work that went into before we got there. There were policy papers written by some of our team. A lot of thought process went into it. A lot of actually looking at who the players are in the manufactured housing, and trying to balance between how the delivery, because it becomes so factual. As part of that analysis about how it works from a financing perspective. There is a difference between who carries the cost of the financing cost from when it actually gets built before it actually lands at the site. And that conversation, I think about every kind of credit conversation we ever had around any kind of project that has manufactured housing. I think 40% of the conversations is all about trying to really understand how does that work? Who's financing that part? Is that the part that we're being asked to finance? If we're going to do a true construction loan, but you kind of can't do that, so how does that work? So it becomes incredibly factual. It does help when you have the the experience of the developer as well as the provider of the manufactured housing, the actual manufacturer, becomes also a very, very large, important part of that discussion. But I say all to say it is doable, and we have done it.
And this is the kind of thing where once you do it and you start to build capacity and people see that it can be done.
Yes, and then the one person who has done it, he's now the manufactured housing expert, because that's what happens at banks. If you do it once successfully, you become the expert in it.
I would. So I'm supportive of manufactured housing, but it's a yes and type of approach. Manufactured housing alone is not going to build us out of the crisis that Andrew so deeply told us about here. It is a function. It has the potential, and I say the potential, to bring units on faster than traditional stick or brick build. That potential is yet to be proven on a consistent and scalable way. It can, in some part of the market, assist in bringing those units on quicker. But we, in the short term, when we talk, and I say short term, thinking about a generation, a sort of a decade, 15 years, we're going to need to build that capacity while we simultaneously use traditional methods of construction.
Yeah. One other idea which we have already heard about from the incoming administration is the idea that we could find space for new supply of housing by leveraging federally owned land to construct it. And this is sort of premised on the idea, I think, that land is the problem or a big problem among the many problems that you have. And so I wonder if any of you could just react to that premise. Is finding and acquiring land, how big of a problem is that among all of the things that you're trying to solve for? And do you think that the federal government has it where you would want to put it?
So I'm going to quickly say, one, it depends on what market you're in, right? So I'm a born and raised Southerner. I'm from South Carolina. Land is not an issue in South Carolina. Yeah. That's not what the problem is. But you can be in other markets where the actual availability of land is the issue and the cost of land is the issue, and that could address some of the issues. Personally, and that is probably crazy to say for a banker, if I had like a magic wand, I would build affordable housing on every single golf site. I'm sorry, I don't understand why they need all that land. Every single golf site, I don't understand why. There's putt-putt, go do that. I don't understand why there's all this land just to hit a ball. And then, but you have to balance that out. I was working on a project in Jackson, Wyoming, and I remember taking that long drive from the airport to the hotel that I was staying at. And I jokingly said to some of the folks, at dinner that night, I was like, "Oh man, all that land I saw on the way over to the hotel, just build on that." And they were like, "Celia, that's a park. It's a national park. You can't do that." So there's some balancing of that. That's a market where there is a lot of land there, but you can't build on any of it because all of it's pretty much surrounded by a national park, and there is a need for affordable housing in a place like that. So I think it becomes very, very market and geography specific, if that's going to be the but-for solution. So.
Yeah.
That's just my comment.
Just real quick before we get a couple more thoughts about land. After we talk about this, with the time that we have left, we also want to take questions from the audience, and I believe that there are a couple of microphones that are set up. So if you are thinking about something you are dying to ask our panelists, please come up to the microphone while we talk a little bit more about land. Priya?
I was going to take the other side of it and say, here in Washington, D.C., it could be really attractive. I would say that the D.C. City government has been effective in using some of its land holdings to revitalize some neighborhoods. When you look at Columbia Heights here in Washington, D.C., 25 years ago, the district helped build the DC USA development, which was the first urban Target long before there was a Target on every corner. And I think that some of those land holdings, and the federal government obviously has very attractive land holdings here in D.C., can help revitalize some neighborhoods, can also drive mixed-use development, where I think it could happen downtown. I think we need a lot more housing there as the commercial corridors become a little bit more sleepy, and I think it could be a really attractive option.
So yeah, so I think, sort of building off what Priya said, I think part of the challenge of the way it's being talked about is federal lands are either used or unused, right? And I think if we take a more nuanced approach to underutilized, right, which are typically more infill locations and things like that, right? So it's not that the federal government isn't using the land, it's just not necessarily using it as intensively as it might otherwise be used, right? So think about like a post office with a large parking lot in a fairly urban location, right? Like you could build up, right? You could build some structured parking. Like there's a lot of creative things we could do with land that is being used by the federal government, but not to the greatest extent possible, right? And if you're thinking about it from a budgetary perspective, right, like a long-term lease on that land, et cetera, where it's not necessarily owned by the federal government, or rather it's owned by the federal government, but not leased itself, could also be a source of revenue for the federal government on an ongoing basis. So I think there's a lot of win-wins as we think about some of the budgetary concerns as well as opportunities for development, but I don't think a binary, we're either using it or it's ready for disposition. I think a more intentional strategy around underutilization and places where it would be valuable. Also note that those are probably places that have access to roads already and utilities, et cetera, that are gonna have a lighter footprint, probably closer to amenities, right? So thinking about the needs of the residents once they've moved into these properties that are built, I think is also part of that equation.
I could think of some parking lots over by RFK that are owned by the federal government where maybe we could put some affordable housing.
Or we could test YIMBY. I mean, the South Lawn is quite nice.
I can't quite see what's going on in the audience, but has anybody come up to have a question that they want to pose? I can keep going if not.
I don't see anything.
No, okay. The conversation that we've been having has been very explicitly about trying to foster the supply of affordable housing, but this conversation is nested within a much larger conversation right now nationwide about the extent to which just building supply writ large of any kind, including market rate housing, that would ultimately contribute to solving the problem for the lowest income renters as well. And so I just want to sort of have us acknowledge and also wrestle with maybe that argument that some of the policy that we're going to wind up talking about is not going to be specifically targeted toward affordable housing. It's just going to be talking about housing supply in general. And so sort of keeping our focus on the people who we know have been harmed most by the trends that Andrew was showing earlier. How confident are you that policy solutions that are geared more broadly toward just increasing supply, or even should we increase supply substantially, that will ultimately benefit the lowest income and most vulnerable renters, who you are primarily concerned with? Anyone can take that.
I'll start, I guess. Okay. So yeah, we're about to embark on some research looking at the degree, the specific question about what the technical term in economics is filtering, right? So if I produce something at the top of the market today, at what point, open question if ever, right, does it become affordable? How long does that take? And what happens to that unit over time as it does? And there's some evidence that in the past, the filtering does happen, both upwards and downwards in terms of where units get positioned in the market. Also, units flow in and out of use, both as for rental and from home ownership. It's a more complicated story than we typically like to tell ourselves about what happens to housing units and to people. But I think one of the questions, in a world in which the gap in affordability between where the market left to its own devices produces, which is up here, right, and what might be broadly considered to be affordable for someone earning half of an area median income, which is probably down here, right, can that gap ever close? I think is very much an open question. So that's one thing we're definitely going to be doing some research on over the course of the next year. But I do think that one of the things that in the short term will likely unlock a lot of supply that we don't even think about on most people's radar screens, because it's happening by individual mom and pop owners, is the availability of creating accessory dwelling units, whether that's like a pod in the backyard or reconfiguring internal space, which I think, from the perspective of a community doesn't change the way things look at all, which is often one of the things that gets pointed to. We looked at, for example, permitting activity in Los Angeles since they liberalized ADU usage, and we found that over the last several years, basically homeowners on their own were opting at a rate of about 1% of the existing single-family stock to add an ADU somewhere on their property, right? So that means over the course of a decade, you're increasing the supply of homes by 10% without doing anything other than changing land use rules, right? So if you think about the role of local constraints in the ability to unlock land for development, like that's happening without large-scale public investment. That's happening without dedicated financing tools. Now, if you could imagine adding that onto, right, you could really put some of that stuff, like, you could accelerate that activity. But I think just as a baseline to understand what happens when you make it available to folks to add more supply, people will choose to do it. So, and some of those units in particular, because they tend to be smaller, tend to be driven by folks who are not necessarily looking to optimize their returns, but are looking to either house a family member or, right, whatever the rationale is, it does create more supply that is likely to be more affordable than new market rate construction in a large-scale multifamily property, in part because of the operating costs and construction costs for dense high-rise development.
Celia, you look like,
No, go ahead. I'll go.
Your face looked like you were really resting. That was the appropriate thing to say in answer to this question. Priya, we'll let you off the hook.
I would say, like with most things in adult life, it's a both and. I think that we clearly need to build supply and we need a lot of different approaches, but left alone, it's effectively supply-side economics, and we saw how that worked 40 years ago. So left alone, it'll take a whole generation, if not two, of people to be left out before you're gonna see that filtering effect. And I think most of us aren't willing to sacrifice those couple generations. So I think you need to clearly look at supply solutions and supply of all types, as to your point, but also look at demand side drivers. And I fear that some of the motivation for the conversation on both sides, I would say, of the political aisle of focusing on supply has been to focus on something that I would argue doesn't exist, no-cost solutions. That we're constantly look at zoning reform and ADUs, and they're tools. They're part of a broader toolbox that is necessary, but they're not the panaceas that I would argue a lot of the media and a lot of researchers have made them out to be. And why I think that people are underwriting that research and putting a spotlight is because they don't cost any money. And somehow we've gotten away from, I would argue, the social contract that all of our social priorities do cost money, and just like Department of Education and Social Security and Medicare are appropriations, reliable appropriations, we knew that on the housing side.
Yeah. Okay, we just have a couple minutes left. We've been somewhat more pessimistic than I intended for us to be because we're supposed to be a solutions panel. We've established that insurance costs are insurmountable, and there's just the one person at KeyBank who's figured out manufactured housing, which is not at scale. So to force everyone to close us on a more optimistic note, if we could go down and we can start with Andrew at the end, tell us something that you are hopeful about, that you think that you feel like is a green shoot that is actually promising and you think it will grow. And
yeah, so I mean, I do think some of the supply innovations, right, about new ways to produce housing are really interesting. And if we can figure out how to do it at scale, they're really promising. I do think like adaptive reuse, of strip malls in particular, office buildings, I think are a little bit more challenging depending on the vintage, but I do think that there is, sort of existing footprints that are ripe for development, that if we figure out how to unlock them, we can do it efficiently and at cost in a way that, I completely agree with Priya, right? Like ADUs is a piece of a larger puzzle, but we need to produce dedicated, affordable on day one. And so I think there are ways to do that, and we just got to keep at it.
Yeah. Celia?
I am hopeful, and that some of our champions at the state and local level will continue to do that. Even even in whatever environment we all find ourselves, and that I am also hopeful, and that we, the folks in this room who are committed to affordable housing, will continue to still focus on the idea that we're all humans and that humanity matters and that housing people matters.
I agree. I'm going to take it a little more tactical. So building on sort of the political momentum that we can see with the new administration, specifically around the incoming HUD secretary or the secretary nominee and their commitment to and history with opportunity zones. I think there are ways for us as a ecosystem to tap into that momentum, that inertia, and benefit housing. Opportunity zones, in my view, as currently exist, are not really an effective affordable housing tool, but with some tweaks, they could be combined. It is an incentive, could be combined with subsidies, whether it's tax credits, rental assistance, et cetera, to drive more capital into affordable housing. And so I do think there's a way for us to partner with the ideas that have been promulgated by the first Trump administration and will likely be in the second Trump administration to benefit the flow of capital into affordable housing.
Priya, you're responsible for bringing it home.
Apropos to, I'm reading NAAHL's tagline on the tote bags, "Homes are where jobs go to live." I think that there's a growing recognition of the role that housing plays on corporate employment, and we're seeing it here in the DMV. Amazon committed over $2 billion to its 3 priority markets, Puget Sound, Nashville, and here in the DMV, and that money and resources has been critical, almost greater than what the DC local government has put into affordable housing. I'm no Jeff Bezos apologist. I think it's all about their workforce and PR, but I think there's a real opening and an opportunity there for corporate America to see that linkage of protecting those jobs and supporting housing more.
Yeah. Well, we have come to the end of our time, and I want to thank everybody who participated on the panel today. We could reconvene and have this conversation again in a year or two and check in on whether or not housing's been constructed on the South Lawn, among other things. But thank you guys so much for participating, and thanks to Sarah and everyone for organizing.
Come on, sit.
Oh.